This week on Hands-On Photography, we're going to take a look at that little funny looking chart that you see in your photo editors, also known as the histogram. Don't worry, you're going to learn a lot. It's going to be a lot of fun. Check it out. Hands-On Photography is brought to you from LastPass Studios. Using the same password everywhere is a security nightmare waiting to happen. LastPass easily creates unique passwords for every site. Visit lastpass.com/twit.
This is Twit.
This episode of Hands-On Photography is brought to you by ExpressVPN. Protect your online privacy with one click. Yes, it's that easy. For 3 extra months free with a 1-year package, go to expressvpn.com/hop. Hey folks, what's going on? I am Pruitt. This is Hands-On Photography here at twit.to in our beautiful LastPass Studios. Hope y'all are doing well. I'm unbelievable as always, here to provide you another bit of tips and tricks in the world of photography that can help make you a better photographer out there with your iPhone X and Galaxy S this and Pixel X that. It don't matter. Even if it's one of these little tiny mirrorless cameras, we're going to share you with a lot of different tips and tricks that's going to help make you better. Each and every week we get together on Thursdays, roughly 2 p.m. Pacific time, which is clearly not that time right now, but it's okay. And we sit down and have these talks. So go ahead and search in your favorite podcatcher of choice for Hands-On Photography. Hit the subscribe button. And then when you get a minute, hit that share button too. So let everybody else know what you're listening to and spread the word of Hands-On Photography, also known as HOP. And before we get started, it's that wonderful time of year where we like to do our annual listener survey here at Twit. So open up your browser for a second, type in twit.to/survey20 and do our listener survey. So that way we can know what it is that you're looking for as a listener, so we can try to create shows and content that's going to be tailored more so towards what your particular preferences are. And it's all private. It's not going to have all of your personal information or anything like that. It's just good research for us, and helps us to continue to grow our wonderful Twit army and give y'all the content that you are looking for. So check that out, twit.to/survey20. All right. So now let's go ahead and get into this week's show. I wanted to go back to the basics a little bit. You know, when we started this show here, several weeks ago, my approach was to break down the fundamentals of photography. I didn't necessarily want to dive in how you can go out and shoot high-key photography and shoot low-key photography. And I didn't want to get into all that because none of that would make sense to people if you don't understand the basics. So we got into what is a DSLR versus a mirrorless. We got into what is the exposure triangle. And now we want to dive a little bit more into that exposure triangle, because there's been a couple times in the episode you'd hear me say this shot is overexposed or this shot is underexposed. And if you look at my histogram, you'll see yada, 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 yada. Well, I decided this is time to go ahead and start talking about the histogram, what it is, and how you can use it in your photography. There's a couple myths around the histogram. I want to try to dispel a lot of that stuff, but we'll dive into Lightroom. Pretty much any of your photo editors will have a histogram built into it. Lightroom has an outstanding histogram. 9 times out of 10, your camera is going to have a nice histogram on it too. Okay, so first, let me open up my laptop here and show you just a random general histogram. So on my screen, you should see a histogram, and if you first glance at it, it probably looks like a diagram of a mountain. No, that's not it. That's a histogram. And a histogram is generally a way to measure your exposure for your photography. A common misconception is when you see a histogram on your photo editor, if it's shaped this way to where it has like a beautiful little peak sort of in the middle of it, you have, in air quotes, perfect exposure. I'm going to tell you right now, don't think that. Just don't even follow that step, or just use this histogram as a guide. Now, notice also that you have all of these different little sections in your graph. The histogram is going to give you a proper measurement of black levels all the way here on the far left of the screen, the black levels in your image, all the way up to the white levels in your image. So I tend to try to have people focus more so on the shadow information as well as the actual exposure. And when you talk about exposure, think about how bright your image is. Your image is overexposed when it's typically too bright. That means you had your shutter speed either way too slow or you had your ISO increased way too high. So that meant a lot more light was hitting your camera and the final picture came out just almost white bright. And that's overexposure. And if you were to look at an overexposed histogram, most of the time you would notice that graph will shift towards the white side of the graph, or in this case, to the right. And a lot of people will speak in terms of exposing to the right, or ETTR is an acronym that you'll see about a shot that's overexposed. But going back to the screen here, if you take a look at the black levels, just because your histogram tends to lean towards the left, that doesn't always mean it's underexposed. It always depends on the scene that you're shooting, okay? Because if I was out just shooting street photography, at a night scene or what have you, 9 times out of 10, my histogram is going to try to lean more so towards the left, towards the black and towards the shadows, because it's not going to be a whole lot of whites and highlights visible to my camera, regardless of what I do. If I try to increase the ISO or slow down the shutter even more, I can do that. But the histogram is still going to say, well, you're still in a dark area, you're still in a dark scene. So it's going to lean closer to that left-hand side of the histogram. Okay, so again, don't necessarily assume that your histogram has to be shaped a certain way. Just understand what your particular scene is and use the histogram as a guide to sort of help you figure out what you need to do from a camera setting standpoint and even help you with post-processing. And we're going to dive into a few more examples here in a second, but I want to take a few minutes to thank this week's sponsor. This episode of Hands-On Photography is brought to you by ExpressVPN. A VPN protects your privacy and security online. Did you know it can take your TV watching to the next level by unlocking movies and shows only available in other countries? With ExpressVPN, binge Doctor Who on the UK Netflix, fire up the app, change the app location to show UK, and refresh Netflix. Their apps use powerful encryption to secure your data, download, click to connect, and then you're protected. Visit my special link, expressvpn.com/hop, and you can get an extra 3 months of ExpressVPN for free. Support the show, watch what you want, and protect yourself at expressvpn.com/hop. Okay, so now let's take a look at just some actual real world examples, if you will. So Mr. Victor, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up my trusty DSLR here, and we're going to turn it on live view so our folks can see what the camera sees. So right here in the wonderful Twit studio here. And all right, so if you look in the upper right of the screen, you'll notice there's a histogram there. And with it being leaning over to the right-hand side, remember I said if it's leaning to the right, you're leaning more towards the highlights and the whites. And that means you're probably going to be overexposed. And of course, if you look at the screen, this is a pretty bright screen. So I need to fix that. So I'm just going to turn my shutter speed to be a little bit faster, and notice the histogram changes with every click. And you even have a little bit more detail showing up, and you can see the scene a lot better. I'm probably going to zoom in right here on Miss Misako right there, because for once I got the camera on you, ha ha. But yeah, if I zoom in on her and I can still see the histogram is letting me know she's properly exposed if I adjust my shutter speed. But if she's, let's see, what if I want to take the ISO up a little bit higher? Let's do that. So that's way too high. So now she's really blown out. So let's go back and adjust the shutter speed again. Back like so. There. Now, got a little bit more balance, and I can even get her in focus some too, if that might help. She don't want to look blurry on the screen, right? There we go. Beautiful. Now, again, just about every camera is going to have some sort of histogram available to you in the viewfinder, especially nowadays if you're shooting mirrorless like this one here. This is the M200. This is a camera that we're looking at here at Twit from Canon. Tiny camera. in comparison to this one, this thing is so tiny. Pretty slick device though. But whether it's a mirrorless camera or a DSLR, you have some type of histogram option built in. With the mirrorless technology today, as you look through the viewfinder, it already gives you a beautiful, pretty much one-to-one reflection of what your exposure is, so that the histogram is going to be pretty much spot on, no guesswork to it. And if you don't want to do it through the viewfinder, you can do it on the live view like I had to do on my DSLR. Because if I just look through my DSLR, I won't see anything. But if I put it up on the live view and get all of the extra details on the back of the screen, then I can see it and then I can work with it from there. All right. So now we're going to hop right on in to Lightroom and take a look at a few more images. So let's go back over here. So now let's compare this image. This is an old image of my boy and our dog when he was just a little bit smaller in the snow. And the challenges with a scene like this is you're going to have bright white snow. Your camera is going to automatically freak out and say, holy moly, I need to speed up that shutter or drop the ISO, because all of this white is just going to be way too bright for my image sensor. So you need to do something, Ant. And if you look at the histogram here in the upper right corner, again, notice it's leaning more so to the right of the graph. And within Lightroom, let me click on develop here, see if this helps a little better. There we go. Within Lightroom, it's built in to have a couple extra tools there. So if I put my mouse here, you'll notice that it's saying the highlights is at this particular level here. And then if you look at the whites on the edge, it's showing that the whites are spiking up. Okay. And then in the middle, you have the exposure. According to this histogram, this is quote unquote underexposed, when in actuality, when you look back at the image, it's not underexposed. I could even increase the exposure if I want, just slightly, and it looks a little bit better. Okay. So that's the difference between using a histogram for a bright scene. So now let's take a look at a darker scene. All right, now this is a dark scene shot at a local coffee house back in North Kakalaki. You know, I sit around, I drink coffee, and I always have my camera with me. And if something catches my eye, I shoot. That's just what I do, right? Don't you do that? Now, according to the histogram, looking over here again in the upper right, you'll see that everything is sort of flattened out because there's not a lot of light coming through here. And if you look over to the left, it's saying, hey, your black levels are really, really high and clipping. If I click on this little arrow here, Lightroom gives me these tips that says, hey, this is how you can show if you're clipping or have way too much information in the blacks, or if you have way too much information in the highlights and whites. And if you go back to my image, the blacks are showing up in blue. Because ideally, especially when you're doing prints, you don't want to have any of these warnings showing up, because it really just washes out all of the details of your image. But again, this is a dark scene. Allegedly, this is underexposed. I don't really think it's underexposed, but I'm going to push the exposure up just a little bit. And that looks a little bit better. But you still have to take into effect that, look at this clipping that's going on right here in the middle of the scene. And even look back there in the back at the highlights. It's just a little bit too bright, a little bit too washed out. So you're going to lose detail in that. And that stuff matters if you're doing prints and if you're wanting to look a certain way on your online portfolio or Instagram or what have you. So you have to keep little tools like this turned on until you get yourself used to understanding, hey, this is what a blown out highlight looks like, or this is what a crushed black or crushed shadows looks like. So I'm going to turn mine off just for now because it's a little bit distracting. And then I will turn these highlights down just a touch. And that changed the histogram. Notice now this side of the histogram went to a much lower value, this is where it was, like that. And you see it's got that spike right there. And now when I turn it down, just half a click, it makes a big difference. And again, that's just basically understanding the histogram as a tool and as a guide, and not necessarily as a this is how it should look kind of thing. And I'll show you a couple more shots. This is from this morning during today's episode of Tech News Weekly, featuring my man, Mr. Jason Howell, and my man, Mr. Micah Sargent. I popped in just to shoot some candidates of them, and actually because I knew I wanted to use these shots for the show today, so don't tell them that. But I wanted to shoot this one at a better exposure setting here. Again, you want it to be a little bit darker and not blown out, because you're going to be battling with studio lighting like what we have here in the upper part of the scene. Then you're battling with the lighting that's right behind them on the wall. So you have to try to find that balance. And if I was to study the histogram and had the histogram tell me to set it to more of a slower shutter speed, the image would have been pretty bad. Actually, the perfect histogram was set to this. But if you look at the image, it's way too bright, way too bright. So of course, to fix that, you would either decrease your ISO or you may increase your shutter speed so less light is getting in. And if you don't have the capability to do that at that particular time, you hop into posts such as Lightroom, Photoshop, or what have you. Take down those highlights like what I'm doing right here. Take those highlights down. Take those whites down. And it'll start to look a lot better. And then I'm going to take exposure down just a touch. There. Looks a lot better, even though it was originally overexposed, and I'm probably going to throw that image away anyway. But this is just a good way to understand the differences between proper exposure in camera and using that histogram to tell you whether you're close to a good exposure or way off or just not even hitting the mark at all. Okay. All right, folks, that is going to do it for this week's episode of Hands-On Photography. I hope this helps you out with understanding the actual histogram and sort of throwing out the myths of what the histogram is supposed to look like. Histogram only matters for your particular scene and your camera and your eye and what the look that you're trying to go after. Just use it as a guide. Use it and understand what the black levels are, shadow levels are, highlights and white levels are. Use those to figure out what you're trying to capture in camera. If you're able to activate your histogram before you hit the shutter, activate it, use it until you get yourself used to understanding what your camera is capable of and able to sort of eyeball what things look like. When I'm sitting here looking at the studio behind the camera here, and if I was to pull up my camera to take a shot, I'm automatically thinking I have about 6 different lights up top that are really, really bright. So I need to change my exposure because those are going to be blown out and give me a big spike in the highlights on the histogram. But that comes with a lot of practice. When you've been shooting a long time, you'll be able to take things like that into effect. And that exposure triangle that we talked about for those 2 weeks, it'll just sit in the back of your mind and it'll start to come a little more naturally to you. So just get out there, keep shooting, and start practicing and dealing and with understanding the fundamentals of a proper exposure. Okay? All right, so if you have any questions and photos that you'd like to share with us, go ahead and shoot us an email at hop@twit.tv. I try to answer them as often as I can. I do read every single one that comes through there, and you guys have still been sending in a lot, and I really appreciate that. And if I'm able to feature one of your images, I will reach out and say, hey, can I feature your image with your permission, so on and so forth, because you're not supposed to just steal images, people. Don't do that. Please don't do that. But yeah, shoot us up an email with hop@twit.tv. Also, head to your favorite browser of choice and just search for twit.tv/hop, and that brings you to our webpage where you can see all of our different episodes from the previous weeks, and you can subscribe on any option that you have, whether it's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, your favorite podcatcher of choice, if you will. Hit the subscribe button on there, and then be sure that you hit the share option on that. Okay. All right. Thank you, folks. Again, I really do appreciate your time, and I appreciate you supporting us each and every week here at Hands On Photography. Really does mean a lot. So now go ahead and get yourself ready. Grab your camera, get out there, go shoot, create, and dominate. We'll catch you next week. See ya.